I thought I had tested it. I thought I had my metric correct, but apparently I didn't. Doctor of Strategic Security. In my spare time, I do judo, I write, I speak, sometimes in that order. And I have 2 dogs, which are Great Danes, which take up a lot of the time, especially with the heat, and they like swimming in the pool. So we're going to talk about the basics. We're going to talk about advanced metrics and accelerating that advancement for you. I say warning, completely 100% not safe for work. So it is safe for work. There's no viruses or malware if you're getting this on a distributed version. However, just knowing the metrics aren't going to get you the job. So that's your sole focus. This is not going to get you there. Also, if you've made a DevOps transition, I say in 6 to 12 months, it's probably not for you. And the reason we caveat that is because it takes some time to get into those baseline metrics. It takes some time to understand what you're doing enough to think about it and make the advanced changes. Starting with those basics is going to get you that first take. And once you've got those basics, you start knowing where they don't do the job for you, where they don't get you where you need to be. And in order to get further, you really need to think through that process and think through that understanding you have of what you're doing, why you're doing it, why it's important to you. So metrics, logs, and traces are great, and you will get them automatically from any number of installed programs and APIs. However, they're not going to fix your problems. They're going to tell you where a problem exists if you understand enough of the metrics to get there. So just looking at those numbers and looking at those processes, like we talked about in some of the earlier talks, getting your vulnerability checks and knowing that there's 79 vulnerabilities is great. And somebody put that out there as a metric, but it's that metric over time, right? Looking at how that changes and how that either decreases or increases over time. And then beyond that, when you talk about advanced vulnerability, looking at what those categories are. If they're all critical vulnerabilities, you got to fix them right now. If they're lower vulnerabilities, you can wait. I've seen some DoD programs, rightly or wrongly, they said, hey, we're going to release every 3 months, which is not a great timeline. But they said, well, our Cat 1 vulnerabilities need to be fixed in 48 hours. So we'll address all the Cat 1 vulnerabilities. And with the Cat 2 vulnerabilities, we have 30 days. And with the Cat 3 vulnerabilities, they're down at the bottom. We've got 6 months. So you know what? We're never going to fix that because we're going to release every 3 months. And we're just going to take this accepted risk and move on. So is it good? Maybe not, but at least it's a metric for them moving forward. So advancing your DevSecOps practices fine-tunes your ability to create those solutions. But it's not the metrics that fix the problem. It's the humans that fix the problems because you have to have something to talk about. And you have to have a ready number and a steady number to be able to talk and quantify what the problem is when you go into management or when you go in and take that diagram Kat mentioned with paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, and you need to be able to simplify that to an easy answer. So starting with some of the basics, why use metrics, right? Why is it important? We'll use a little bit of 5 why structure to kind of ground the talk, ground some of the discussions in. Well, our metrics give us a quantifiable and repeatable source of observability. We don't just have the observability, but we can move forward from that observability to measure the multiple processes and create things to drive actions. Because ultimately, that's what you want from the metrics, is you want to drive an action. You want to create some type of number or some type of analysis that helps you get to the next step, that helps you get to the idea you have to move forward. So if I say why, and I do my next why, I say, well, why do I need a quantifiable number? Why is it important for me to gather this information in this manner so I can move forward? Well, people make a lot of decisions based on instinct. There's somebody say, well, I think we're doing good. I think we're doing bad. I feel like we're delivering often enough, but they don't actually have a quantification. So they've done some studies, and a lot of these I like to reference other people because I do a lot of reading in my spare time. So there's a book out there called Noise by Kahneman, Savoni, and Sunstein. They did a lot of analysis of things that affect your analysis. They found that 77% of a randomly generated linear model, something that makes decisions based on a randomly generated linear, are better than the human making decisions against the same data set. So any model is better than somebody coming in and making a decision out of it. Right? So that says, well, if I have it quantifiable, at least I can have some type of linear model applied, which is going to help me make a better decision. So why don't people understand the numbers? Well, people tend to overestimate their own ability to make good judgments based on the data, right? Most people think they can make good predictions. If you ask them, they'll say, oh yeah, that's absolutely the way we're going. So, well, are you confident in that? Yes, I'm confident. I'm confident in my abilities. I'm confident that the next thread is coming from here. We're going to deliver at this rate. The product's going to be done at this time. But they don't get the right answer. In this book called The Wisdom of Crowds by Sir Wiki, he found that large groups get a better answer, but only when they're selecting for that random group, right? When they're assessing the weight of a cow at a state fair, and you're looking at the cow and you say, how much does the cow weigh? People put in their guesses. They put in wildly different guesses based on their own experience, what they think it weighs. Well, the average guess turns out to be within about 10% of the right number. right? It gets very, very close when you take that average. So that average is good. But the people have still made the wrong decisions on that individual basis. So we need to get something that takes in that aggregate and builds it back out to us to move forward, because we don't get the right answers. And actually, as a side note to this one, when people get the opportunity to talk to each other and they have to put in one guess together, they're still wildly wrong. So it's not the group information, it's the aggregate of that group information that gives numbers. So how do numbers improve my options? Well, numbers provide that repeatable comparison through linear judgments. They give you that measure over time that you can show you're improving or you're failing to hit the target you want by understanding the metric and understanding where to go forward from there. A great book for this one is Measure What Matters by John Doerr. He talks about key performance indicators and how to set those. More importantly, he says, for reference to metrics, that you don't always need to succeed. You want to have some things that you're not going to succeed at, so you can target those for improvement, right? You can target where you need to make those changes and where you need to take those actions to drive forward. And then finally, why do I need to guide my actions? Well, if we go back to Agile and DevOps, we need those actions because we want to accelerate delivery. And if we don't know what's going on, we can't accelerate. We just continue making the same process and the same thing over and over again and get to those same answers. And that's not what we want. We want to have that continuous improvement, right? That flow in the feedback and the continuous learning. So how do you know what you know? If you're looking at metrics, I've decided that I need some metrics. I need to think out. This is a model I use a lot in intelligence. I find it still applies here. It's a basic model for critical thinking, right? Thinking through a problem that you have. What's in front of you? The first question is, how do you know? Somebody's given you a number and they said, hey, this is what we're doing. And you say, okay, well, how do you know? And then in an actual discussion, they said, well, we took all the numbers off the system and we got the user rates and we got the percentages of downloads, and then we added that in, and then we wanted it to be in this format from 1 to 5, so we multiplied it by this random number that we inserted in the algorithm's constant. Well, okay, what is that random number actually doing? It's like, well, it's converting it to the range we want. Well, that's kind of good, but you should know a little bit better than that what kind of manipulations you're making and how that affects the correlation of those numbers as you go forward. So after you know how you know, I know I'm getting it from Grafana, I know I'm getting it from Prometheus, I know I'm getting it from my edge scanners, that they're bringing me the right information. What should happen next? If I get that number, should I see it go up? Should I see it go down? Should I see it continue on that straight level? What do I expect to have happen once I get that initial number? And then once you have that, and you're kind of sure you're moving forward, the next is, well, what also has to happen to make that true? And in the case of my edge scanners, I have to make sure they're working correctly. I have to make sure they're connected back to my central servers, right? And they're communicating the information correctly. I have to make sure that I'm getting it in a timely manner so that I don't have one edge scanner that's reporting every 24 hours, one that's reporting every 15 minutes. And then I'm getting a widely different variation of that information. So in following that, do the conclusions I have, do the assumptions I've made about what should happen, follow what I said I had for my premises? Do they follow that path through? And then I look at it again from my own perspective, taking a look and say, are there any other arguments I need for those premises to be true? Is there anything else that has to happen that I haven't thought about? That maybe site X, where I have information at, does a reset on a regular basis. So I have to account for their reset and how their reset's going to change my numbers because they're going to drop offline. So now I'm only getting information from site Y and Z, but Y and Z don't get as much business as site X does because site X is our primary customer. So I have to know how those go forward. And then finally, I want to compare apples to apples and not oranges to elephants. When I look at oranges and elephants, I see they both have a tough skin. They both have a name on them. So that makes them relatively comparable, right? Well, no, when we look a little bit further, they're not quite the same thing at all. And somebody said, well, but they are, because you know what? They're both juicy on the inside. Like, all right, we're stretching it, but they're not comparable. And you see this when people try to take a number and they try to compare it to another team. You see it when Kanban teams try to compare it, they're output to Scrum teams, and they're not measuring the same rates. They're not measuring the same details. One of the stories I had back from intelligence that really illustrates this example is they were measuring power rates in Baghdad during the Reconstruction. When they were doing Operation Iraqi Freedom, they were trying to build Baghdad back up, and they wanted to make sure that they had power for all the citizens. Well, they were measuring it by the average megawatts supplied course of the day. And they said, you know what, we're supplying 15 megawatts of power on average every hour, every day. That's great. We can keep everything up and running. They said, well, that's great, but then why are people so unhappy? So they went down and they looked at the metric and they found they were doing the average every day. So they were taking the high production in hours and averaging it against low production. But where the low production was happening, where they weren't getting enough power, where they were getting brownouts, was between about 10 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when it was really hot outside and all the air conditioning was shutting off, which meant instead of staying in the house and being happy, people were going outside talking to each other, talking about how frustrated they were, which was not what they wanted at all. So you can see where the metric wasn't comparing the right apples to apples because the amount of power they had didn't actually apply. And finally, as a note for this, when you're looking at it, dashboards do not equal awareness. They create an observability, but your dashboard should be a start for your discussion. It should be a track of those metrics, a track of those items that you can then look at and drive further. So if you're looking at this, you need to start where you are. You need to recognize where your organization, your team, your company is, and figure out how the metrics apply to you, what you need to do to move forward, and what your process is. Do the initial surveys, do the assessment, talk to people, find out both what you're getting and what those premises are by actually talking to people who are inputting those numbers or collecting those numbers for the data entry for the process. You want to make sure that the metrics are repeatable and contextual data, that you have the context for those metrics that is appropriate as you move forward. Maybe some sensing sessions, not just the initial survey, but getting a group of people together and saying, you know what, these are some of the things we found on the survey. This is where we need to talk about it. And a lot of that goes to building that trust algorithm that's up there, right? People have to trust you to get the metrics because it's the humans that are going to fix those problems. And that comes from the credibility, reliability, and empathy over self-interest. That's probably a whole other talk on itself. But know where you want to go with your metrics. Create that shared vision objectives that says, I want to deliver, I don't want to deliver, and maybe use the value stream techniques if you're using them to align it to your pipeline to figure out how all those things map together. I'm probably talking way too fast. But if we go back to DevOps and we think about a basic DevOps model, and why we're looking at DevOps, we want to create flow, right? We want to create structure that goes forward from knowing where our understanding is, knowing where our constraints are, and making sure that what we have moves forward over time. And the reason we want a smooth flow is because it allows quick feedback. It allows us to get the information we want. In the term of a metric, it allows us that contextual linear data that provides us the right answers to get to the next step. It allows our individuals to fix the constraints, to figure out where our flow is being hampered or our flow stops. It allows us to maximize our value return by having those quick answers. But then that drives the continual experimentation learning, which is a lot where metrics come. A new metric is continual experimentation. It's putting in and saying, the metric I have doesn't answer the questions I want. It answers a question, but I need a different question, or I need a different sense of approaching it in order to get the right answer, or to get an answer that means something for me. And we'll talk about this a little in the later slides where we talk about, that I have a change failure rate, but I don't really know what that means. I've just got a rough number or a rough assessment of what goes forward. Or I've got a time to deploy, but I've modeled it. And, there's a great quote out there that says, once you start gaining the metrics, once you start figuring that if I get a good metric, I get a promotion, those metrics no longer matter. Because what you have is instead of getting a true metric or a true analysis of what's out there, you started gaining it and doing things to make you have better metrics without actually having a better system. So once we have the 3 ways, I have 4 paths, right? 4 things that we normally look at to create metrics. The first is logs. Logs are the track of everything that goes forward in the system. They are based both on time and a complete description. So they include all those calls, all those APIs, all those references back, all that orchestration, all goes into that big, huge log, right? And that can be good, and we can build metrics off of that, but it's not always what we want. So sometimes we just use traces, which are the specialized type of logging, which tracks the input and output for a specific program. One API, or one set of calls, one server, tracking everything that's going on there, so we can have the right answers. The metrics then become a standard measure of degree to which a system or property or process possesses some property, some comparison or analysis. Maybe it's how many users use over time. Maybe it's the power generation in the city by hour or by other sense. Again, lead time to deploy, how long does it take you to deploy, what frequency am I deploying at? And along the way, we also have measurements, which some people forget. Measurements are just looking at something and saying, this is what it is, right? This is how often I'm deploying a good thing. This is how often I'm doing this. But they don't necessarily have that same sense of metric that they're going to drive an action. It's just a number. And we see a lot of people who want to pass off measurements as metrics. They want to say, I deployed so many things. And this is a lot where you get the variable too. We had a team that looked at it and we said, hey, we're going to run on a Scrum basis. We're going to have these epics, which are these huge stories. And we think an epic should take you 6 to 12 weeks to complete. And one of the team owners decided that their metric was going to be the install of a new version. Every time they installed a new version, they were going to pass off a metric. So they looked across the teams and they're like, you know what? Your team is doing 70 epics every week. And this team is doing 1 epic every 3 months. So what's the difference? Why is this team working so much better? And that's when you look in and you find out, hey, you know what? In context, all they were actually doing was install. And each install took them about 15 to 30 minutes. So all of a sudden, they changed the reference for the metric. They changed how they were looking at it, and they changed how they were going forward. So the 4 DevOps metrics, and we'll center for the rest, we'll kind of concentrate on these, look at how we can advance these basic metrics that the door book, accelerated by Nicole Forger, tells you should have, right? Tells everybody you should have. So what we see is because she told everybody they should have these, every organization starts up and says, I'm going to be agile in DevOps, starts with these 4 metrics. But they're not really sure what they mean, and they're not really sure how to apply them, other than the fact that they have them. And if they have them, they must be good, right? Because the book said it's good. So lead time to change, so the time it takes bug fix, new feature, any other change to go from development to production. So when somebody brings me a new idea, when a user comes back and says, I have a bug, how long does it take for that idea to go from the backlog all the way to production where the thing is actually fixed? Now, one of the things, and I saw this recently with the team, that you have on this one is they say, okay, we're going to measure this, but we're only going to measure this with things that we've completed, right? Any item that's done, we have a lead time to change. And they were feeling really good about themselves. And then we went back through their backlog and looked at the issues they had. And they weren't counting anything that was started and not finished. So things that had been put in as an idea, that they agreed they were going to work on, that they prioritized and broke down, but that weren't finished, didn't go into the lead time to change. And that's a big change to that metric, right? That's a big change to how you look at that, how you look at the advance. So that top metric is good, but it's not necessarily the best. The second one they have in DOOR is the deployment frequency, a measure of how frequently your team deploys code. Another great one, right? If we're deploying, we must be in good shape. We're deploying new stuff and new items, we're doing great. What you see with this one is people tend to gamify, especially in large organizations. They look at it and they say, well, every time I deploy to production, I'm getting a point because I have a deployment frequency. And that's intended to keep the deployment small, which it is, because smaller things get done faster. And we work on them faster. But they take that even further and they say, well, every time I write a line of code, I'm going to deploy to production. I'm going to make those changes because it's not fixing anything. I'm going to comment it out, but it's going to deploy. And now I've got this huge number of deployments for things that aren't really delivering functional software. And then we get to the opposite side of it, the mean time to recovery. How long does it take a device to recover on average from those failures? And the change failure rates. The number of deployments in which something goes wrong out of the number of deployments in any given time, right? How often am I deploying bad things? Same thing you gamify. If I'm only deploying a line of code and I comment it out, it's probably not going to break the overall program. So I don't have to worry about that as much. So quick samples when you look at it, right? If you start at DevOps, and I like to look at security, which is in the middle. You have DevSecOps, right? You have all those things out there. So you have those 4 basic metrics that we look at: lead time to change, deployment frequency, change failure rate, and mean time to restore. Those are great, but there's probably some other answers, some other metrics we want to look at in those things that get us there. First of all, we don't have anything that solely measures security. We don't have anything that security champion or that security team can look at and say, where's my security in these DevOps metrics? Are you calling it a change failure rate because we've released a vulnerability? Are you calling it on the mean time to restore and how long it takes to fix or to add that new patch from CVE in? Well, it doesn't really sit there. So if we break out and we use that same metric of, how do I know? What do I know? How do I get there? These are some of the things I kind of whipped off and said, maybe we want to talk about pipeline success. Maybe we want to talk about how often those pipelines fail. If we've got a good pipeline, we should have a high number of failures because we're finding things and we're fixing them on the left side of the equation, right? We're fixing things, we're identifying those things to fix early in the process. Maybe we want to talk about languages. Maybe we've got a bunch of teams and they're all using different languages to get their systems through. On the security side, maybe we don't just want to talk about the failure. Maybe we want to talk about how many risks were released. I mentioned earlier about those code 3 risks, or those cat 3 risks. Maybe we want to talk about how many of those were actually released into the environment as we run the process forward. Maybe there's a scan coverage. In a lot of teams, we talk about test coverage and scan coverage, or test coverage as far as how many things we're actually testing. What percentage of the code is actually getting tested before we feel safe to release it? And we get that in the pipeline. Maybe there's a scan coverage as well. How much are we actually scanning for those vulnerabilities? Do we have a set percentage that we feel it's safe to scan to move forward? Do we remediate those vulnerabilities in a sense of time? How often do we fix them? How long does it take us to fix them? If we can fix a Cat 1 vulnerability in 3 days, but it takes us 6 months to fix that Cat 3 vulnerability because it's downloaded into the system, or it takes a separate policy statement to fix that Cat 3 that we go through, and we have to get signed and approved, and we need to wait on somebody else. Maybe we want to know how many of those vulnerabilities get remediated. How many of those tools are we using for scans? How many scans do we need per release, and how often does it take? We had a team that was working, and they'd done their DevSecOps stuff, and they built the scan in the pipeline, and they were using the Nessus ACAS system to do their scans. And it was great. Everything was going. They knew what the risks were. But then they decided that it was taking too long because every time they ran it took 4 hours, regardless of how much it was scanning. So they turned it off during the week and only turned it on during the weekends. Well, great idea, right? They're saving time. But they weren't doing any coding on the weekends. So everything had been deployed into production beforehand. And they set the scans that were running on the weekends, and they weren't scanning anything new. So even though they shifted it left to start, they shifted it back right and moved the process. And now they're changing that time. So maybe we want to know how many scans per release. On the ops side, maybe we want to know how long operational time, right? The 5 nines, 99.999%, and how much time do you lose? How many analysts does it take me to find a failure if I'm talking about change failure? How many people do I have to take off what their normal job is and put into that to look at that failure to do the process? How many hours is it taking me to do that part of it? How much time do I have available? How much time does it take me to respond? Once it goes into the system, when do I know that I start that mean time to restore? When do I know that it becomes a failure? Is it in my internal sense? Or is it when somebody called me up and said, you know what? I can't get into my account. I can't get to my checking. I need to pay bills. What's going on? Now, that's one way to look at it. The other way is we can look at CALMS, right? Which is our other DevOps model, the culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing. And we can break it down the same way. And we can look at some of those things. But that drives us to some different types of metric ideas as we drive forward. Maybe in culture, we want to talk about happiness. Maybe we want to talk about the number of events attended, global reach, retrospective coverage. How much are we talking about in retro? To actually go back and talk about the things that we found were failures in one of the other models or one of the other metrics. The dashboard's creating that awareness to drive that discussion. Maybe we want to talk about how many automation tools we're using. A lot of our teams have a tendency to bring in new automations, new tools all the time. We saw the new shiny object, and we bring that in as well. And then we bring the next one, and then we bring the next one. And now we've got multiple tools all doing the same thing. And we don't know what that overlap looks like. We don't know what that interaction between the things look like. Again, we get things like test coverage, test duration, path coverage, how many of those pass forward. We have multiple VMs that we're using, and we're only covering some of those with the dev. Maybe some of them are larger. We talk about the lean, right? Quality, stoppage for review, blockers. And these get all more of the team sense of looking at metrics, right? Transparency, how much can we see when we're talking to each other? Do we have a lot of chat channels? Do we have a common bug channel that everybody comes in and has a bug, dumps it in the same channel? Or they dump it into 6 different channels. We have one for the team, we have one for management, we have one for bugs fixed, we have one for bugs released, we have one for user feedback, right? And we can't correlate the information between all those things to get to the sense we want. So that gives us a great number of ideas and a great number of things that we talk about or we think about. But how do we do it individually? How do we break back to those things and we think about? What are those steps that you want to think about when you're advancing your metric and you're starting with it? So we're going to start with the 4 door metrics. We're going to talk about some of those questions that we have as we drive forward. Maybe the first one we talk about advancing lead time to change. We talk about how long does it take to complete an action? What kind of measurements, what kind of systems are we getting when I talk about it? When I talk about story points, I talk about hours, I talk about days. If you use the Atlassian tools, Atlassian likes to talk about days a lot. That's your users are actually putting in their actual hours. So instead of having that it took me 3 hours to complete this action, I have it completed in 1 day, whether it takes me 3 hours or 8 hours. Does that affect my lead time to change? If I can only measure in days, maybe I can hit 1.37 days, and I can conversion to hours, and I can go back there and get something else. But I don't necessarily get it all the time, right? Maybe it's the work in progress. How much work in progress do I have when I'm looking at it? If I only, that varies between teams, right? Maybe the team wants 2 items in progress that they're going to work and complete it, or the other team has 16. but I'm still changing those times, so I'm changing those factors. To identify the constraints around my advancement lead time to change. What slows down my lead time? What factors affect my lead time when I'm thinking about it? Is it that I have to wait for the end of sprint demo before I can release? That I need to get that approval as I step forward, or I can bring it back and do something else? I say who built the task when we get it. Is a customer building the task and putting it back into that backlog, and then I'm handing it off to a developer that doesn't have interaction. I get varying tasks and varying complexity, and I have no way to measure between those complexities. But we see story points help, but not always. We see managing the team structure to get to assigned versus complete, knowing what the various parameters are, and then comparing the different features. Am I focusing on the priority that I have, the priority for scaling as we go forward? How much work do I actually assign to that team? We see teams too often in the sense of being overconfident in making the wrong judgment, regularly take on more work than they can actually handle in the time they're supposed to handle it, right? We regularly see teams and they say, well, if the example is I've done 38 story points last time and 38 story points the time before, this time I'm going to take on 60 story points because I know we can accelerate and handle it this time. And then you look at that metric over time and say, how much did you complete? You say, well, you've never done more than 41. And that's over the past 6 months. So what makes you think you can do these things? An important caveat for this one is we talk about metrics and why I say this is 12 months. If you don't have that baseline, if you don't have that structure, you don't know how to build forward. You don't have enough of a baseline to drive you. And every time you make changes to that team, every time you start swapping people out that are integral to that team, your metrics are going to change. And they're going to change a lot to the point where you need a new baseline to go forward. Teams see this as a replaceable part, right? They see more like Legos. Well, if he was a yellow Lego with 8, little nodules on the top, and he's a blue Lego, it doesn't matter because I'm swapping an 8-piece for an 8-piece, right? They're the same thing, but they're not. They make a change in that overall structure. They make a change in the metric goes forward. And then, of course, we've got to talk about security and change, right? How does the change affect the vulnerabilities that we have? How does what you put in lead us to the next change? Did I comment out the MFA because it was causing problems and I didn't have it? And I know that S said that single sign-on wasn't coming till later, so I can just comment that out until I need it, but I'm still submitting the change. But it's going to take me a long time to get that SSO working as I integrate the multiple tools. Are there impacts in the code delivery? Do I have the time and the right teams assigned for security? Do I have the champions in place who are actually looking at it? Or do I have a bunch of developers that are just taking an initial look at it? Not that they don't know security, but they may be taking a different look at it than doing a more integrated threat model, a more integrated process. We talk about advancing the deployment frequency. How long from delivery to production? Do you know the constraints you have in getting delivery to production? Does production mean it's actually delivered to the customer? This is one of the ones we see that doesn't get measured. The team says it's done, they hand it off. The product owner takes it, says it's done, they do the demo, and then it doesn't actually make it to the customer, even though it's in the production environment. Because they're still supplying it to a repo, they're supplying it somewhere else, where someone has to go and download that, make use of that product as they go forward. How do you know that it's been in production? Are you getting the feedback? Do you have the metrics and the network analysis that people are actually downloading and using that? We see a lot on teams that they have it and it went out there, but nobody's using the new version yet. They're all still using the old version. They haven't done the patch, they haven't done the update. How do you make sure that you have the awareness of that that deployment is actually making sense? When you do the testing for deployment, what makes success in your test? Is it just a check? This is another good story. I had the team, we briefed them on using DevSecOps. They were doing their initial transition. They called me in the next day. They said, hey, we've got this. DevSecOps, we've got a handle. And we put the scanner in. Every time we finish the code and we're ready for deployment, it runs a scan. I said, great, let's look through the logs and talk about vulnerabilities. Let's talk about what's actually wrong with those deployments and how you're fixing it. And the individual looked at me and said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you scanned it. There's a log and it talks about your vulnerabilities. And he kind of said, oh. I said, well, let's pull it up, right? Show me the GitLab. Let's take a look at your pipeline. So we looked at the pipeline. Sure enough, the scan was in there right to the left. Every time I ran the pipeline, I ran the scan, and things were looking good. The variable for the scan was set for true. Every time the scan ran, it counted. Good. So we did help them in the end. We got back, we got it set for to actually produce the log. And once we got the log, because there's a lot of information on the log, right? It shows everything. We ran a diff tool so that it compared our scan against our baseline and identified anything that needs different. So any known risks that they had or anything that was changing as they did the new deployment was coming back. And then they could fix those things instead of trying to fix everything and get into all those cat threes that we already knew were going to be known risks or accepted risks that they didn't have to spend their time on. So we make assumptions about change when we're doing deployment frequency. We should identify those assumptions with change. We should identify the assumptions we have. We should write those down. We should update regularly. These are things we want to constantly be talking about, right? This is where the dashboard helps to start those discussions because we have that measurement over time that shows us all the processes are and how they go forward. So time to restore. Do you have a process to recall that figures in your time to restore? You have to redeploy everything into production. And are the only people that can do that devs? Or are you running on a blue-green system where you have two different systems, you're deploying code in one, and they're gradually shifting users? You have a canary deployment that's telling you when something fails. And then you can use that again, you can shift back to another one. Do you have the good site reliability engineer tools, right? Have you done a site level agreement that if you're depending on someone else, if you're going to that edge, now you've got to get a field engineer at site X who goes out there and resets the button manually. Do you have the agreement with them of what their timeline is to restore? How often they're going to take to go out and fix things? And what are your indicators of those, which become a whole other set of metrics, right? For the service level integration or indicators. When you start talking about these mean time to restore, you want to talk about the root cause. Because if you don't identify the root cause, you're just going to deploy the same for every. And then this number is just going to continue. And nobody likes to see that your time to restore continues at a high rate, right? You want to see it at that low rate. You get your systems back up online as soon as possible. And you get them working as soon as possible. Or if you can't get the new version working, you can roll back to the old version. And it's still working for that customer. They're seeing the same things. How long does it take you to discover? How long did it take you before you started restoring? How long was that failure in production? And what did it actually cause for you? How long does it take you to fix it once you identify the root cause? Does security view the root cause from that threat model? Are they looking at the attributions for that? Are they actually looking at who's out there? Now, an interesting note for this, a lot on the commercial side, we don't really care who did it to us as long as we make the fix, right? Attribution doesn't mean anything unless I want to take an action. I don't need to know necessarily who did it. All I need to know is that they did it, what happened, and then I can fix it so we can't do it again. How does that convert to implementation and lead time? How does this affect my lead time if I'm having lead time to restore? Does it change the rate at which I'm getting new answers in? If I was expecting to have a new version in production, and I'm expecting to start getting bugs back in, right? So I blocked some time in my development that I'll be able to work on those bugs. Now, none of those new bugs are coming because nobody's out there. Nobody's actually running on the new metric. Nobody's actually running on the new system. What are some of the factors that affect the time? Items that slow recovery time to restore. Management approval. How many of you have been in a system where in order to make the new improvement, in order to fix it, you've got to go back and you've got to get management approval? And it's 2 o'clock in the morning, so you've got to get the manager up, you've got to get them aware of the decision, you've got to tell him what that decision is, then he's got to call in and approve the new change because you can't just release it on your own. Is there an SRE you need to call? We can fix these. We can have a site reliability engineer that has the authority and has the accountability to make those changes for it. We can automate some of those fixes like we talked about with the blue-green deployment. Hey, as soon as I have it, I go back to the old version. Restore up for the customers, I'm good. Now I can work on fixing those new changes that I made to move forward. A help desk that can tier those requests and find out who can actually solve that problem. Is it a quick fix that the help desk can solve? It's in the documentation, the user didn't see it. Is it a slightly longer fix? It's going to require a little bit of configuration, a little bit of code, the engineer. Or is it a whole new bug that we need to send back to the development change to get through? And how long does it take to get through those notification chains, right? So advancing change failure rate. You don't want to deploy failures. Find out why. It still starts with the root cause. 2 great books on finding why. Simon Sinek's Start With Why. It's a process and a leadership book, a DevOps book, but it's great in looking at those analysis, right? And getting you to think about how do you know, what do you know, what are those factors? And as I mentioned before, John Doerr, Measurable Matters, talking about KPIs. What are the things that make us successful? What are the things that drive us to those success rates and drive us to those abilities to move forward? We need to compare those whys when we think about them. Are we getting the same root cause over and over again when we have that change failure? Maybe it's time for company-wide failure or company-wide training on that new version of Kubernetes that they're supposed to be using, but they haven't all made the change. Maybe if we understood what those processes were, if we understood that common why across every failure that was happening, we'd have less failures because we fixed it earlier in the process. We build the knowledge, we build the identification, get forward. And partial successes, what made it a failure? At what point do we declare that it's failed? Is it when it brings the whole system down? Is it when it decreases network performance by 10% or network performance by 90%? Where have we set the standard of where we decide that this change we've deployed has actually created a failure? It's made it through the pipeline, so we've had the tests. We've had everything it's supposed to check, but now it's still failed. Why is that failure happening? What has happened? And how do we measure where that failure happens to compare across? And we identify the premises, which is what I was just doing, right, around the failure. What are those standards around the failure to move us forward? What are some of the root causes for early identification? We want to fail early. We want to fail in the pipeline, not when it's actually deployed to production. We want to gather our group together and learn quick. Failure is an opportunity to learn in an agile frame. The more we fail early, the more we can get together and find the answers to move us forward, to accelerate our processes and accelerate our delivery. It creates the opportunity for us to succeed in the future because we've had this small failure. And that's what we want is the small failures that move forward. So where do you go from here? Well, first, non-decision creates error, or decisions create error, right? Anytime you make a decision, you're creating an error somewhere in the process. Because even if you don't think there's an error, there's going to be an error further. There's going to be something that your decision makes that creates a problem. And even as far back as, hey, I'm going to hire this new guy. And he's great. He's got all the skills. We're bringing him. Okay? At some point, he's going to make a mistake because all of us make mistakes. And that's going to create the error in your system. But non-decision, not making that decision is going to invite disaster. You need to have the information at hand. You need to have the metrics at hand so you can look at what's happening and you can make an effective decision, a useful decision, even if it creates an error further on. Because the errors create our opportunity for success. They create our opportunity to learn and our opportunity to move forward. We say both of these go back to the second law of thermodynamics. Way too many engineering classes along the way. The second law of thermodynamics says any static system, the entropy is going to increase. If you have a closed system, if you're not making any changes to it, it's going to eventually fail over time. Nothing runs forever, even code, right? There's going to be friction involved by continually running the process. There's going to be friction involved by doing things. And eventually, there's going to be some entropy, some chaos involved in that system. And you're going to have to make a decision to fix that entropy. Because if you don't, we're back to the disaster phase, right? Things are just going to break, and when they're going to break everything instead of breaking that small part that you don't want to fix because we have the identification metrics. And with that, that gets us back to our metrics. You have to know the base rate. You can't know what that base rate is, what that baseline metric is, unless you have the metric. Unless you have the metric geared to the way that you want it, that makes the most sense for your team, that creates value and creates success and driving forward. One of the key ways we learn about making new metrics is the growth stops. When our growth stops, we want to model the best tools. We want to find why did the growth stop? If we know why the growth stopped, is there a metric we can use that'll show us that the growth is slower before we actually get to that stopping point, before we get to that failure point? How do I identify that metric that's coming through? How do I identify the various things around that metric that I need to know? Maybe I need new sensors. Maybe I just need a new metric. Maybe I need a new process along the way that does something different, that shows me a different analysis like this. We see those four basic door metrics, and we see the teams that go with that, and they say, well, I'm going to have lead time, cycle time, and delivery time, and I'm going to focus on those things. Well, it only makes sense if you're doing the right things, right? If you're looking at those metrics and they're vanity metrics, the only reason you're collecting metrics is because they make you look good. They may not be helping your case a whole lot, or they may not be helping you improve, even though they help your case with management, because management loves it. But the time is, it's going to get to something that matters, and it's going to get to something you have to do differently, and you're not going to have enough of the numbers, you're not going to have enough of the basis to go through. I had a recent discussion, and this goes back to people make assessments and people are overconfident in their own judgment. And I was talking to the individual, and we were talking about how many items they had blocked over the previous event, how many items they had blocked, and what was blocking them, and why it was blocked. And she said, well, we've been blocked this often, and this is what happened. I said, okay. She said, it's this organization. They are blocking us. They are stopping us from doing what we need to do. I need you to go and improve that in the numbers. I said, I'm happy to go in and look at the numbers. I'm happy to go in and do all the research, do the analysis, look at your tickets, look at the notes, look at the code, and figure out why you were blocked. And I came back to her and I said, hey, you know the reason you were blocked? It's because your people were submitting the wrong information to that organization to get the document approved. If they'd submitted the right information, they would have approved it in a day. Because they submitted the wrong information, they took a week to review it, they took another week to look at it, and they sent it back and said, you sent us the wrong information, you really need this. And then they went back and forth again like that. And she said, well, that's great, but that's still not the information I want. I want to know how many days actually that team blocked us. I said, all right, they're not your primary cause, but for the sake of argument, we'll go back in and we'll look at the metric. So we went back in, we looked at the metric, we found out of 176 days that their various code items were blocked for the various teams that they were responsible for. There were 43 days that were blocked because that organization delayed, didn't have the right information, didn't give them an answer. Well, unfortunately, there were 176 days that were blocked for other causes, such as having bad code, not giving the answer to the other team. They were all internal and they couldn't be focused. So you got to know how the numbers get there. You got to know why they're important, what the assumptions are that they're making. Because that's what enables you to find that baseline, find that standard rate, you know how to change what's going forward. And you do that through using metrics and through understanding your metrics and getting to the next steps. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. Let me go find this early if you want. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take questions. You can reach me out in these links up above as well. All right, great. Thank you for your time. Yep.